All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. For those folks that are online and for those folks in the room, really excited to have you here for our seminar. My name is Cinnamon Moffett. I'm the Research Program Manager at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center, located in Newport, Oregon, if you happen to be online. And I just wanted to let folks know that if you are online and you're having any technical issues, Roseanne is our technical support person. So go ahead and put any of your issues into chat. She will let us know here in the room and we'll try to get those fixed for you. Also, for those folks that are online, your mics, cameras have been turned off. So remember, if you have any questions, just go ahead and use the chat or raise your digital hand and Roseanne will be able to unmute you at the end of today's presentation. For those folks in the room, most of you are familiar faces by now, but make sure you've signed in so that we can keep track of who's here. And if you have any questions, you will need to raise your hand at the end and I'll bring you this mic so that you can hear, for folks online that can hear you. So I appreciate that. Couple quick announcements. We are recording today's event. So if you are interested in watching it again or sharing it with others, you can go to the HMSC past seminar page, click on today's seminar, and you'll be able to see a video of today's talk. Also wanted to do a quick promo for our speaker next week. We're very excited to have Paul Engelmeyer come to talk to us about beavers and climate change. So that will be a really, really cool talk that Yichang has just found out about 2 hours ago that we got the speaker here. So excited about that. For today, however, our speaker has been invited to us by Megan Mangrove, and so she's actually going to do the introduction. So I'm going to hand off to Megan.
Thanks, Cinnamon. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Megan. I am an assistant professor in engineering, in coastal engineering. And Hannah just started working with me this year in May. Hannah and I met probably by happenstance in New Hampshire. I was doing my undergrad there, swimming, and Hannah lifeguarded for me very probably. So we've had a long history, although we didn't know it. And then Hannah more recently worked for the Applied Physics Lab at the University of Washington. She's deployed a bunch of moorings and collected sediment cores, and so she has a lot of knowledge in that arena. And then she decided to go back to grad school and worked with Andrea Ogston at University of Washington, studying sediment dynamics in the Myanmar Delta, and did a fellowship in New Zealand. And she's going to tell you all about sediment dynamics and the mangrove restoration practices that they have going on there. And now Hannah is working here at OSU main campus, and she's looking to stay here in Corvallis, Newport area for the foreseeable future. So yeah, feel free to ask Hannah questions or see more about what she's interested in up to. So I'll let Hannah take it from there.
Make sure you go green.
We're good? Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. I am very excited. I'm not used to talking with such a large screen, so I apologize if I point just generally at the screen. I'm used to that meaning something. And thank you for the introduction, Megan. So yeah, today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work I did for my PhD when I was at the University of Washington. But I'd like to start today with a land acknowledgement, to acknowledge that colonialism is an ongoing process. I'll acknowledge that Oregon State University in Corvallis is located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River or Ampinifeu Band of Kalapuya. And following the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to reservations in Western Oregon. Today, living descendants of these people are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. So I'd remind you, as many of you are visiting here, that land acknowledgements are not a chore. They're an opportunity to learn and engage with the places that you live and work and travel. I also wanted to introduce myself, just especially for some of the undergraduate and graduate students in the audience. Please do get in touch if you're curious about hearing anything about my background. I love to chat with scientists. So as Megan said, I grew up on the East Coast, where I probably saved her life. and went to college there, studied Earth and Oceanographic Science. And then I worked as a field engineer at the Applied Physics Lab, playing with heavy machinery and putting googly eyes on instruments. And then in 2016, I went back to get my PhD with Andrea Ogston in the School of Oceanography. And I started out studying the Elbow River Dam Removal Project, which was the largest dam removal project to date. And then I went on to work on the Ayeyarwady River Delta in Myanmar and some work in New Zealand, and I'll talk about a few pieces of that today. But I also wanted to just advertise what we're working on now, because it's pretty crazy and cool. So right now I'm working on distributed acoustic sensing with Megan. And the basic idea is that we can turn fiber optic cables, the same cables that are sending our internet all over the world, we can theoretically turn them into arrays of sensors to monitor the ocean. So we have a lot of processes in the coastal ocean that we want to be able to observe, and we have these cables, and we're just trying to put them together. The basic principle is that when those cables are transmitting data, some of that light that they're transmitting is reflected back towards the source, and we can use that to measure very, very small nanoscale changes in the length of the fiber, and we can relate that to coastal processes. So I'm working with some data from Duck, North Carolina, and I'm still sort of playing around with how to clearly visualize this data because we just get so much data. So you guys are guinea pigs for another experiment, trying to demonstrate. So this figure I'm showing here is from our Duck, North Carolina data. It's just a few minutes where we can actually see waves propagating onshore across a cable. So that's what I'm working on now, but I'm going to completely transition us away from sandy beaches and fiber optics and think about some warmer climates. So this data may feel like we're doing a harsh transition, but I just wanted to introduce sort of what I'm interested in as a scientist. And that's essentially how are low-lying landscapes maintained, transformed by natural processes. And we can sort of think of like 3 spheres of science that get involved in this question. So first would be the shape of the landscape to begin with. So that'd be the morphology. But then we have water flowing over the landscape, and that water is carrying sediment in it. So that's the sediment dynamics and hydrodynamics, which is interacting with the landscape to change the landscape. And then on top of that, we have things growing and living on this landscape, and that's the ecology. And in reality, these are all interacting with each other. And so if we want to understand how our landscape is evolving, we really have to understand how these forcings work together. And then the other part of this is that we as humans tend to live in coastal areas. And so I really want to understand how we can sustainably, but also realistically live in these landscapes. So what happens to these different processes when humans alter some aspect? And as a sediment dynamicist, that's what I would call myself, I tend to think of the world in terms of different regions where we have a lot of sediment coming to the coastline. So that's what I'm showing here in this figure, where we can essentially divide the globe into regions based on the total amount of sediment being delivered to the coastline. That's what those black arrows are scaled by. So you can see that black arrow coming out of South America that's really dominated by the Amazon River, the largest river on Earth. And we also have quite a big arrow over on our west coast over here. We have a lot of mountains and rivers delivering sediment to the coastline. And that's really what's controlling the size of these arrows. Anywhere where we have both elevation, so mountains, so tectonic processes, as well as precipitation, we're going to have mountains eroding and that sediment being delivered down to coastlines and forming sort of coastal features and especially river deltas. So far I've been talking about some of the smaller arrows on this diagram, but today I'm going to focus on this giant honking elephant of an arrow in Oceania and Asia. And this is a region of the world where we have a huge amount of precipitation. It's dominated by monsoon seasons. And we also have a tremendous amount of elevation. This is where the Himalayan mountains are, which source some of the largest rivers on Earth. This landscape that's fed by all of this sediment, we have all these rich landscapes which tend to be really ecologically vibrant, which means that they tend to be great places for agriculture and aquaculture, so fishing, which means, of course, that they tend to be densely populated. So there are many mega cities in this region of the world, and many of those mega cities are located on river deltas. So I can list just a few, being Shanghai is on the Yangtze River Delta, Ho Chi Minh City is on the Mekong River Delta, Dhaka and Calcutta, two huge cities, are on the world's largest delta, the Ganges-Brahmaputra River Delta. And then we also have Bangkok on the Chao Phraya, and the Yangon, city of Yangon on the Ayeyarwady River Delta. So these are huge population centers. We have a lot of people living essentially at sea level on these coastal landforms. So as a scientist, I want to understand how those people can live sustainably and realistically in that landscape. Now, the other piece that comes into play here, if we look at the globe once again, is that in this region of the world, the dominant type of coastal vegetation is mangroves. So in our part of the world here on the West Coast, we mostly have temperate salt marshes. That's the green on this figure. But over here, we mostly have mangroves. So when we're thinking about what ecology is sort of dominating our coastal landforms, we really have to consider the role of mangroves. So what is a mangrove? It's sort of a broad catch-all term. Mangroves are the only type of large woody tree to grow in salt water. And so they're relatively unique, but there's quite a bit of variability. There's 54 species of true mangroves. And then there are many more species of what are called mangrove associates, which I just like that term because it makes me think of like a tree with a briefcase and the mangrove's like, this is my associate. Total aside. Mangroves have some really great adaptations to allow them to grow in water that's salty and to be regularly inundated and be okay with that. So they tend to either grow pneumatophores, which are these fingers that grow up from their roots into the water column, or they grow prop roots or stilt roots down from their trunk. But either way, they're creating this really dense and complicated coastal area. And so as a result, mangroves provide so many ecosystem services. They're really incredible. Mangroves are awesome. And any one of these ecosystem services could be the focus of a talk. I'm going to talk just today about mangroves as a force for coastal protection. So because they're growing in the coastal zone, they're really good at absorbing storm waves and also trapping and retaining sediment. And so if we want to understand how to sustainably and realistically live in these landscapes, we really need to understand these mangrove coastal processes. So that's going to be the focus of my talk today. First, addressing how do mangroves sort of interact in a natural environment, and then what happens when we remove the mangroves from a coastal environment. So what happens when there's sort of an anthropogenic stressor. And I am going to talk about this in two different locations. First, I'm going to talk about a mangrove forested island in Myanmar. And then we'll transition to thinking about the region around that island in Myanmar, where the mangroves have been removed for agriculture. And then I'll finish up by contrasting with another study from Aotearoa, New Zealand, where we looked at the removal of mangrove that was actually motivated by a desire to restore an estuary. So a really interesting and contrasting case study. But first, I'll talk about the Ayeyarwady River. So just to give you a global perspective, we're talking about this region with a massive amount of sediment being delivered to coastlines. And Myanmar is located in southern Asia there. You might wonder, why should we care about the Ayeyarwady River and Delta? So one of my advisors used to call the Ayeyarwady the largest river that no one's ever heard of. It is the third largest source of sediment to the coastal ocean. It's really, really massive. It's kind of hard to understate just how large of a river this is. And part of the reason that it's such a large source of sediment to the coastal ocean right now is that there are no dams on the main stem of the river. And this makes it relatively unique 4 large rivers. So it's a relatively natural system, especially compared to nearby rivers like the Ganges Brahmaputra, the Mekong, the Yangtze, all of these other rivers that are on this map. The river is almost entirely contained within the country of Myanmar, which is part of why it's a relatively natural system. Myanmar was isolated from the rest of the world for a very long time, which meant also that the scientists there were not able to connect with the global scientific community. So it's a relatively unstudied system. And in the early 2000s, Myanmar opened. It is now closed again to the outside world. But during that time, we had this great opportunity to connect with researchers there and investigate this relatively natural system and learn all these things and broaden our scientific community. So I'll zoom in. I was on the delta of the Ayeyarwady, which is just in that southern portion of the country. I was very fortunate as a graduate student to be part of a research program focused on the Ayeyarwady Delta. It was a collaboration between the University of Washington, Patain University, and Myanmar Maritime University. And the first thing that we were looking at was sort of like big picture. How is this delta maintained by the river? How is it functioning on a really basic level? How do processes vary across the delta? And we collected data all over the delta. We traveled all over the country. And I'm not really going to get into the details of that today, but I put up the citation for that work if you're curious and want to dive into details. Today, I'm going to focus on a sort of smaller scale study that we did within this larger picture study focused on Meinmahla Island. So Meinmahla Island is located roughly in the center of the delta, and it's a mangrove forest preserve. So you can see in the satellite imagery that the island itself is really dark green. That's the mangroves. And the countryside around is this weird purple. That's just an artifact of the satellite. But what it indicates is that all of that is agricultural land that has been deforested. So you can see Meinmahla Island as this sort of oasis. And so it's a perfect place to investigate this initial research question of how do mangroves sort of naturally interact with our landscape. And so you might wonder how exactly we go about studying this island. And I have a great quote that I found. So the British initially colonized Myanmar, and they're interested in assessing their timber resources of this new colony. And so they sent people out into the forest, including to Meinmahla Island. And this was from one of their reports. They say the most the forest officer could do was to cruise through all the creeks, which would admit a small launch, and to make occasional excursions into the indescribably filthy mud of the forest itself at low tide. And this could be my method section. This is essentially exactly what we did. We cruised around through the island, collecting data on the water flowing through the island, and then we would get out and collect sediment cores to look at how sediment was accumulating in those mangrove forests. So in a little bit more detail, we deployed instruments at the southern end of the island to look at sort of these seasonal trends. And then during the dry season and the wet season, we went for more intensive surveys to try to calculate sediment flux. And this is a term that I'm going to use quite a bit through the talk. Sediment flux refers to how much sediment is being transported by the water. And so in order to calculate that, we need to know the suspended sediment concentration, SSC, and the water velocity. And if we calculate that at a single point in time, we can get an instantaneous sediment flux, or we can integrate over a tidal cycle and get a net sediment flux, or the overall direction that sediment is being transported. So we use a whole variety of instruments to try to measure that. We both place instruments in a single location to watch, and then we also would carry instruments on our boat as we cruise through those tidal creeks and made lots of observations. I'll also point out that Meinmahla Island was a very fascinating and beautiful place to work, but it was also a challenging environment to work in. Partly because it was not only a mangrove preserve, it was also a crocodile preserve, which we initially were very comfortable with because we were seeing relatively small crocodiles. And then we met the alpha male, who is a 18-foot long crocodile. And then I felt a lot less good about all of the 6-foot-long canoes that we'd been paddling around in, and all of the swimming that we had been doing. But everything was good, and I got to see a 6-meter-long crocodile, which was pretty awesome. On a more chill note, we also, on a very regular basis, saw my favorite creature, which is the mudskipper. And if my lab had a mascot, it probably would be the mudskipper. These are really common, ubiquitous creatures in these tropical muddy environments. They're a couple inches long, and they literally skip across the mud. And when they encounter another mudskipper, they like kind of shout at each other and then run away. And so I did a little bit of research on this, and I'm just curious, like, I'm going to take an audience poll real quick so you can shout out your answer. Do you think that the mudskipper lifespan on average is longer than, shorter than, or about the same as the time that it takes a said labber to get a PhD? Shorter? Same? Same? Shorter? Anybody think longer? Okay, thank you. So it turns out that they're about the same. So yes, they're Dr. Mudskippers. They could get a PhD if they really tried hard enough. So mascot of my work. Back to the science. So what are we actually doing in this photo? We are collecting a sediment core. And that allows us to calculate how fast sediment is accumulating on this island, which will tell us whether it is keeping pace with sea level rise or whether it's going to sink below sea level. And what we observed is that Meinmahla Island is aggrading, which means it's growing upwards, and it's also prograding, which means it's growing seawards. So it is accumulating sediment at a pretty high rate that is greater than local sea level. And if we look at aerial imagery from the 1970s to now, we can see that the end of the island has actually grown further seaward. So this is an island that's really good at retaining sediment. And if we want to understand exactly how that's happening and how the mangroves are involved, we need to look at sediment fluxes. And so here I'm just going to show a little bit of data from an exterior channel of this island. So we might perhaps think that's where most of the sediment is coming from, is just being directly transported into the island by small dead-end exterior channels that sort of peter off and meander into the forest. And so that's where we put one of our instruments. In this diagram, I'm going to show quite a few times in various different locations. On the x-axis, we have water velocity, where negative values are ebb tide and positive values indicate flood tide. And then on the y-axis, we have water depth. And each data point is colored by the suspended sediment concentration. And so this can tell us a lot about how the transport of water and sediment are related to tidal stage. But really, I just want to highlight for now the fact that the suspended sediment concentration is consistently higher on the flood tide compared to the ebb tide. And we can calculate a net sediment flux, which is a relatively low value, but is consistent with what we would expect for a mangrove forest. We expect these trees with their pneumatophores and prop roots to be really good at retaining sediment. And that's what we observed. And we can scale this value based on the number of exterior channels around the entire island to estimate the total amount of sediment delivered to the island by these small dead-end exterior channels. And it turns out that it scales to only about 0.1 centimeters per year, which is significantly lower than the rates of accumulation that we were observing. So this tells us that there has to be some other process involved in keeping this island happy and healthy and above sea level. And so that's where we turn to look at interior channels of the island. So you'll notice in this overhead image that the island is cross-cut by many channels that have more than one entrance and that sort of meander through the island. And we can put an instrument there and observe how the water velocity and suspended sediment concentration change with the tide. But what it turns out is that looking at a single point location is very complicated. There's a lot happening. And so this is where we had to turn to the surveys that we collected as we were cruising through these tidal channels. So here is, I admit, a lot of data. It is surveys along a single high connectivity channel collected both during a flooding tide, first during the low flow or dry season, and then during the high flow or wet season. And the top panel is showing the water salinity, and the bottom panel is showing the suspended sediment concentration. And there's a lot of information here, but what I just want to highlight is that in the island interior, during both seasons, there are distinctly different water masses. So they have a distinctly different salinity, which will control whether or not or how fast they're mixing. And so this actually generates a tiny estuary at the mouth of this high connectivity channel that acts to pull sediment in, and we can see that there's sediment being sort of pulled into the mouth of this high connectivity channel. And so the island is essentially actively importing sediment into these interior channels where it then can be delivered to land surfaces and retained by those mangrove trees. We can also think about how this type of process might impact the channel itself. So we have water and sediment transporting through the channel, but they're also changing the channel itself. And so that's where more aerial imagery comes in handy. We have surveys going back to the 1960s of this same high connectivity channel. And there are two arrows up there that I want to highlight. So the white arrow is pointing to a location where a new entrance was formed sometime in the 1960s. We don't know exactly what caused it, likely some type of storm event. But once that channel opened, the entire that whole length of the channel started responding. And especially where I've highlighted in yellow, we see that the channel has started to close. It's gotten narrower and it's been rapidly colonized by mangroves. And if we look at our surveys along the channel, that region is actually quite a bit shallower. So it's getting completely filled in by these tidal processes that are pulling sediment into the island. And mangroves are very rapidly and happily colonizing that new land. Whether this is going to eventually completely close, I don't know. It's an interesting question that's sort of up for debate. But overall, what we see in this natural landscape is that mangroves retain sediment and maintain their own habitat, and that they can opportunistically respond to change. So next, let's think about what happens when the mangroves are removed from the landscape. And this gets at this question of essentially, can a deforested delta that's now being used for agriculture, can it keep pace with sea level rise? Which is a really fundamental question if we're thinking about how and whether people can sustainably and realistically live in these landscapes. So I've just labeled on here 3 deltas that are major agricultural centers for not just their own country, but for the world. And in these regions, one of the major crops is rice. And if we want to understand whether or not these deltas can survive, we really need to understand how this agriculture is happening. And there are sort of 2 end member styles. Either way, they're cutting down the mangroves. So that's something that's similar. But some of the fields and essentially some whole towns are surrounded by a levee or an embankment that prevents water from flowing into the field, except when the farmers want it to. Other fields are left entirely unlevied and relatively natural. And so what we see, for example, in the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta, they have a lot of these levied or embanked fields. They're also sometimes called polders. And what they do is they build the polder or the levee so that farmers can grow crops during more times per year, which provides greater economic stability. However, what we've observed is that those fields tend to sink very rapidly and fall below sea level. So that if an embankment were to fail during a storm, the entire area would experience dramatic flooding. So it's not really a long-term sustainable long-term type of agriculture. However, in the Ayeyarwady Delta, there are a lot of these fields that have very few levees. So this is a photo taken right next to Meinmahla Island in an agricultural field, and you can see that the water is just freely able to flow into that field. And so we wanted to understand whether or not this was a more sustainable form of agriculture in terms of land use. So at the same time that we went to Meinmahla Island, we also went and visited this agricultural field. We measured the absolute elevation of both sites and also once again deployed instruments to look at sediment flux and we collected sediment cores. And I'm going to start with just the elevation data because it tells a really compelling story in and of itself. So here is the elevation data that we collected from 2 sites in Meinmahla Island and 1 site in an agricultural field. And the x-axis is distance from the river mouth. And then the y-axis is the elevation relative to a locally useful reference point as 0, which would be mean sea level during high flow, but it's not a sort of global number. But overall, what we see is that there's a fair amount of variability in the topography, mostly due to small changes or human alteration. But overall, the field is on average about 1 meter higher than Meinmahla Island, which was a little surprising until I stepped back and thought about the place where we were working, which is a delta. And a delta is a fundamentally sloped land surface. And our field sites are actually far enough apart that we have to take that slope into account. And so when we put a few estimates on our graph for the slope of the delta, the field is actually at the same relative elevation as Meinmahla Island. And this field is about 40 years old. It's been in use for a very long time. And so this data alone suggests that this agricultural field is significantly more stable than a levied field. We can back this up by looking at how and when sediment is transported into the field. So once again, we have water velocity and depth. And once again, what we see is that the suspended sediment concentration is higher on the flood tide, both in Meinmahla Island and in the agricultural field. So we're seeing the same sort of trend, even though this is a deforested environment. And so it suggests that we calculated net sediment flux, and they have a similar net sediment flux, suggesting that the agricultural field and the rice that's growing there is acting in a similar way to the mangrove forest. It's also good at trapping sediment. And so initially we felt a little bit surprised, but it actually makes sense when you look again at a photo where this agricultural field looks a lot like a salt marsh and can behave in a similar way to a salt marsh, which is also really good at retaining sediment. And so overall, we see that unlevied agricultural fields are much more sustainable and might be over the long term, better investment, even though you can't grow as many crops in those fields per year. So can we predict how and where mangrove removal will have a large impact? Well, in this environment, we found that the mangrove removal did not have a large impact. The field could still retain sediment because there was still vegetation and because we didn't cut off the pathway that delivers sediment to the field. And so just to finish up, I'm going to now transition to consider a very different location and what would happen if we wanted the landscape to change. So here we essentially don't want the landscape to sink or dramatically alter. We just want to be able to have agriculture on the landscape. But what if we actually wanted the landscape to change? And this is where we're going to go and look at a site in New Zealand. So we're traveling way far south in this region with lots of sediment input, down all the way to the southern limit of where mangroves can grow. And as a result of them living at this far southern extent, they tend to be really stubby. They're very adorable. So just for scale, here is my collaborator, Deborah Stokes, in an Australian mangrove forest. And you can see that the trees look like trees. And then here she is on the bottom, wading through about chest deep mangrove trees. So they're really stubby. And they only grow on the northern end of the North Island of New Zealand. But they are native. They are a native species. They are a natural part of the landscape. What's debatably less natural is what's happened in the interior of New Zealand. So in the 1800s and 1900s, there was a large influx of people, and there was a lot of agriculture and a lot of sheep farming. And so people cut down trees all over the island interior, which caused a dramatic amount of sediment to then be eroded off that interior landscape and be delivered to coastlines. And so there's been a lot of coastal infilling and problems with coastal turbidity. And the mangroves expanded concurrently. And so as a result, mangroves are actually viewed fairly negatively in New Zealand by many communities, especially by people who are trying to maintain habitat for bivalves, which are an important food source for many people, including for Maori people. And so in many sites in New Zealand, there are either sanctioned or unsanctioned mangrove removal programs. So they really need to understand, when will these mangrove removal programs be helpful and when are they not actually going to solve the problem of having these muddy estuaries. And so we went to one of these sites, Waikaraka Estuary in Tauranga Harbour, which is on the north end of the North Island where there are mangroves. And here I'm showing a plot of the mangrove coverage in the estuary since 1940. You can see that it expanded to a maximum sometime around 2003. And that's when this photo was taken. You can see all around the estuary is a mix of residential and agricultural land. And then in the estuary, the brown is muddy or mud or sand. And the light green is mangrove forest. So in 2003, they got permission to remove mangroves from the estuary and maintain at about a 7% extent. And so if you look at the estuary, I'll now change to 2016. Mangroves are just this narrow fringe along the border of the estuary. And I'll go back one more time. There. And so their goal was to have mud leave the estuary. And that was sort of a really basic science question that we went and investigated with. We collected all sorts of data to really look in detail at this estuary. We mapped, we did biological surveys to see if bivalves were coming back. We did some coring and deployed instruments to look at and measure sediment flux. And just so that New Zealand doesn't feel left out, I also had fun interactions with wildlife in New Zealand. I was harassed by a duck. And I also just love kiwis. They're the national bird of New Zealand, and I had a fake kiwi that I traveled around with. You may also notice in this photo of the duck that there is a lot of mud. And basically the moral of the story of this whole research project is the mud is still there. The mud has not left the estuary in the past 15 years following mangrove removal. Those are my footprints, and I was going about knee deep into the mud. We can look in more detail about why this might be so that we can understand where mangrove removal might actually help. And so we once again deployed instruments all through the estuary to measure the suspended sediment concentration and the water velocity as the water level in estuary changed. And I'm just going to highlight these two values. If we multiply those together, we can calculate our net sediment flux. And if we look at that over time, this is just a few days of data, but we can see that at the station that's right at the mouth of the estuary, there's some sediment leaving. But if we look all the way up at the top where that yellow instrument was, there's essentially no sediment going anywhere, and certainly not leaving the estuary. And even the sediment that's leaving close to the mouth would essentially result in less than 1 millimeter per decade of erosion. So the mud's not going anywhere fast. So we know that following mangrove removal, the mud didn't leave. But can we say anything about whether mangrove expansion was at all related to why mud is in the estuary in the first place? And for that, we had to turn to numerical modeling. So we can make a model of this estuary in a computer program, and then that allows us to change all sorts of things. And we can change the mangrove extent, we can change the bathymetry, we can change the water level, tides, all sorts of things to sort of play around and find out why this estuary filled with mud. And I'm just going to show one brief result, which is that if we look at those same velocity water level diagrams, the top row is showing actual data. And then the bottom row is a whole bunch of model results where we change the mangrove extent a bunch. And essentially, it did not change anything. The flow in the estuary is very strongly dominated by how the tides are interacting with the estuary. And so the mangroves are essentially incidental. They are opportunistically responding to this environment. So what if we want the landscape to change? Essentially, in these sort of protected embayments, mangroves will opportunistically colonize these environments, but the mangroves are more of a symptom of a broader issue, which is the increase in sediment delivery to the coastline. And so removing the mangroves is not going to change your estuary or result in restoration of bivalve habitat. And so now I just want to transition to sort of like a brief wrap up of all of these different studies. I know I've sort of thrown a lot at you. I wanted to cover a broad range of topics. But coming back to these questions of how are low-lying landscapes maintained by natural processes, and how can we sustainably and realistically live in these landscapes? So first, we see that in these coastal environments, sediment is continually being transported between rivers and channels and islands by natural tidal processes. And that it's really critical to maintain those pathways if we want sediment to continue being delivered to the landscape so that it doesn't sink below sea level. In addition, if we want to think about how mangrove removal will impact these environments, we really need to think on a site-specific basis. That we know in general, when we remove mangroves, it can cause erosion, but that at any given site, existing conditions might dramatically alter the results from what we expect. And so when we're thinking about management, we know that our observations can't be infinite. We can't observe everywhere, but we have to take that regional or spatial variability into account. And with that, I would just like to emphasize that the work I've presented here was not my work. I'm sort of like the tip of the iceberg of standing on top of all of the shoulders of giants. I had a lot of help from my collaborators at the University of Washington, Patain University, Myanmar Maritime University, Yangon University, Southern Cross University, University of Waikato, as well as a lot of support staff. And I was funded by a whole mess of organizations, including a fellowship from the ASLO. I'm now forgetting what ASLO exactly stands for. American Society of Limnology and Oceanography, something like that. Great. So if you are a undergraduate or graduate student, keep your eye out for those sorts of opportunities. It was like an email that I saw one day and I was like, that sounds kind of cool. And it ended up being a chapter of my PhD. And then I was able to find sort of like other little pots of money from my school to fund that work. So it is possible. And with that, I'll say thank you for listening. And I would be happy to take questions.
There we go. All right, thank you so very much. I'm just going to start and throw it out and see if there's any questions from online. Okay, we've got one comment coming in.
Okay, there's one comment. Wonderful presentation. One of the first slides says 10.6 tons of sediments from rivers of the world each year. That seems like a tiny amount compared to, say, beach erosion. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes. Yeah, so that is, I guess I've never thought exactly about how much beach erosion sediment is being delivered to the coastal ocean, but I will say, so this is sediment being carried from mountains eroding and being delivered to the ocean, whereas beaches are essentially already part of that littoral cell. And so this is new sediment being introduced to that environment. And that number includes both sand and mud. It's not just a suspended fraction.
All right. Any questions from folks in the room? All right, one second.
Nicely done. I'm curious in your work in Myanmar where you have that channel closing in, but there's still really big channels cross-cutting there. So what's reversing it? Like, why do they not all just close?
That's a great question, and one that I would love to study like as an entire PhD. The short answer is that there are still tides being forced through the island. And so the island landscape is a balance between those tides that have to force their way through and sediment depositing in certain locations. And so the tides have to be accommodated somewhere. And it's kind of a matter of where those tides are going to be accommodated. In terms of why exactly we get these channel patterns, nobody knows. There's really nice, clear relationships that are observed in purely fluvial systems where you have water going one direction, basically, it just goes downhill. But in tidal systems where we have water going in and out, we don't have nice numerical relationships yet. So it's an exciting area of research.
All right, we got one more question from in the room.
So in New Zealand, when did you do the same nutrient studies that you did in Myanmar? Like with I guess the question is that now that you have removed they've taken away a lot, like they've removed a large amount of mangroves, have there been increased rates of eutrophication in the surrounding water because they've been removed from the system, or has there been little impact on that?
That's a great question. And one that I am not very qualified to answer because I don't know much about the ecological like fishing community there or the benthic community in the rivers. Excuse me. And I don't have a clear idea of how much actual fertilizer they put on the fields. This is fairly, not low technology is not the right word, but these are small scale farmers that are hand plowing their fields, so they're not delivering huge amounts of nitrogen, but it is still agriculture. And so I don't have a clear idea of how much impact that has on the ecosystem. But that is a great point. So mangroves provide many ecosystem services. Retaining sediment is just one of them. So cutting down the mangroves, it might not immediately result in your field sinking, but that certainly doesn't mean you're not impacting the environment. Yeah, that's like a whole nother realm of research that somebody should tackle.
All right, any questions online? We have a question online. It's coming in just a second.
Hi, I was curious if the range that you worked in on the Ayeyarwady River was the same that the dolphin population is around, the Ayeyarwady dolphins.
The Ayeyarwady dolphins, I believe, actually go even further upriver than where we are working, but I think they do transit through the region. And they are seen around Meinmahla Island. I never got to see them, disappointingly. They're a very unique and rare species of pink dolphin, I believe. They're super cool. And that's about all I know about the Ayeyarwady dolphin.
All right, thank you for that question. Any other questions in the room? All right, one second.
So I'm wondering, in the Myanmar study, you had the two sites that were on the island with the mangroves and the one that was in the rice paddy, I guess, right? That was way far up river. So are there more rice paddy areas downriver, like closer to where you might also see waves?
That is a great question. There are not many rice fields that are abutting beaches. They actually, you might be able to kind of see in aerial imagery of the delta. There tends to be a fringe of forest. You might be able to sort of see it here. We don't tend to have agriculture right up to the beach, at least not in this region. There are agricultural fields slightly further south from where we were working, but it's about as far as farmers can go before the water is permanently salty all year round. But there are also places that have been deforested up in this region for other infrastructure reasons that are also susceptible to waves.
Do you think that those areas would have the same kind of infilling as the upriver one where and the mangroves?
I would suspect so. In the Mekong Delta, in similar regions, they see really terrible erosion as soon as you take the mangroves away from a coastline. And I think that is really the difference, is that an environment that's dominated by tides can still retain sediment, but coastlines that are protected by mangroves from wave energy, as soon as you take the mangroves away, the coastline disappears. Yeah. And so there must be some like transition zone.
Any questions in the room? Okay, I had just a curiosity question.
Yeah.
For the rice harvest,
Yeah.
between the two different types of paddies, the one with the levee and the one without, is it the same mechanism?
Yes. Essentially, they still are flooding the field, I believe. It's just in the leveed fields, they can pump fresh water in during the dry season when the river is otherwise salty. Whereas in Myanmar, they only grow one crop per year during the wet season. And that's really the fundamental difference, is whether you can grow one crop or 2 to 3 crops.
Yeah, I was just thinking whether there was a mechanical compaction difference between the two, but it sounds like
interesting. Yeah, I don't think so. At least certainly there are other fields with a similar type of harvesting and planting method that are seeing dramatic subsidence because there's a levee. And basically no one else is looking at these unlevied fields, so we don't really know.
Interesting. I was just trying to compare to some of our levied fields here around. We have a lot of the same issues up in Tillamook where things have been levied and the fields are dropping. And
yeah,
I'm just curious. All right. Any other questions from folks in the room? Question for somebody online. Go ahead.
Okay, we have a question. The Mississippi Delta has been expanding for centuries. Is the Ayeyarwady Delta expanding similarly? Could high altitude estuaries receive more mud per unit of water flow?
I think it's debatable whether the Mississippi is still expanding. That's certainly one thing to consider, because the Mississippi has had a dramatic change in sediment and water flow. The Ayeyarwady, and actually this image is a perfect example. The Ayeyarwady has essentially, it grew further south to this current extent very rapidly. And its current extent is essentially limited by this mountain range. It's kind of hard to tell, but this is actually a mountain range. And the delta grew to the end of the mountain range and then is essentially maintained there by strong wave action. So it's probably not going to grow any further south, but it did on geologic timescales. The delta grew very rapidly, grew something like 80 meters per year until it reached that southern extent. And right now the delta is being maintained by the river because the river is not dammed and sediment can be delivered to the delta. The Mississippi is kind of sinking, as people in New Orleans know, and that's because sediment delivery has been dramatically changed. And that's a common problem on these large river deltas. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to take one more call for questions in the room. All right, let's give it up for our speaker and just say thank you to him. All right, just a reminder, it's been recorded, so if you're interested in watching it again or sharing it, you can do so. And we hope to see you again next week, same time, same place. All right, everybody, thank you so much, and thank you for those online. All right, for anybody still online, we're going to go ahead and end the presentation. Thank you so much.